It was February 1879. Elias Hawn had been in the Gallatin Valley for 14 months, and he'd spent most of them cold. Not the kind of cold you complain about on a winter morning before the coffee works. The kind that gets inside the walls, gets inside the blankets, gets inside you and stays there while you sleep. So you wake up stiff and tired from fighting it all night without knowing you were fighting anything at all. He'd built his cabin the right way, or what he thought was the right way. 12-foot walls, pitched roof, split cedar shakes, tight as he could make them. He'd followed the same plan his neighbor Caleb Marsh used, the same general shape that every homesteader who came through that valley in 1877 and 1878 seemed to build. It looked like a cabin. It functioned like a cabin. In October, it was fine. In November, you needed a good fire. By January, you needed a very good fire, all night, every night, and you woke up anyway to frost on the inside of the walls. Hawn wasn't complaining to anyone. He just knew something was wrong with the arithmetic of the thing. Wood cost him a day's work every 2 days of heating. He was burning through his winter supply faster than his estimates, and his estimates had seemed reasonable. Then, the week of February 12th hit the Gallatin Valley. Temperatures dropped to negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The snowpack was already 4 feet deep in the low ground. His fire couldn't keep up. The water bucket 2 feet from the hearth froze solid overnight. He burned his emergency wood reserve, then part of the furniture. That was the winter Elias Hawn went looking for a better answer and found it in a place he'd already dismissed. About a mile up the drainage behind his property, set back into a hillside where cottonwoods crowded the creek, there was an old trapper's cabin. Hawn had ridden past it the previous spring, looked at it once, and decided it was worthless. The walls were a mess, thick round logs notched together in a way that looked sloppy, gaps visible from 20 feet away. The roof was mostly dirt, half buried in the hillside. Dark inside, low-ceilinged, small enough that a tall man couldn't stand up straight in it. He'd assumed it was abandoned for good reason. In March 1879, after the worst of the cold broke, Hawn walked up there to pull it apart for the logs. He needed material. His own cabin was drafty, under-insulated, and had already started showing the signs of hasty construction. The green wood had shrunk over the winter, opening seams he hadn't planned for. He figured an old trapper's pile of logs was better than nothing. He went with an axe, a pry bar, and a sled. He came back with something he hadn't planned on. What Hawn found, and what took him several hours to understand fully, was a building that had been carefully, deliberately engineered for exactly the conditions that had nearly beaten him. Not by any architect, not by any formula he'd ever heard of, by someone who had spent enough winters in the Rockies to know, at a bone-deep level, what the cold actually does to a structure and what a structure has to do back. This is what he found, and this is why it worked. Let's start with what most people know about old frontier cabins, because most of what people know is wrong. The popular image is this: desperate men, rough tools, any logs they could reach, walls slapped up fast before the first snow. Crude, primitive, kept people alive only because the alternative was dying in the open air. The thinking goes that settlers who had time and resources built real houses, and the log cabin was just the rough draft, something to survive in while you figured out what you actually wanted. That image has a problem. The log cabin that killed you in January wasn't the sloppy one. It was often the one that looked the most respectable. A shake roof looks better than a dirt roof. A hewn, squared log wall looks more finished than a round log wall with visible gaps. A raised, level floor looks more like a proper house than a packed earth floor. These things signal civilization, investment, effort. They read as progress over the rough-hewn trapper shack up the drainage, and in the winter of 1879, they were killing people. Hawn's cedar shake roof was elegant compared to the dirt roof on the trapper cabin. His R value, had he known the term, which wouldn't exist for another 50 years, was something like R2, maybe R2, 5, on a good day. The dirt roof on the old cabin, 8 inches deep, packed and settled over years, sat somewhere between R12 and R18. Snow accumulated on top of it, and fresh snow insulates at roughly R1 per inch. 2 feet of accumulated snowpack over that dirt roof added another R24. In the February cold snap that had nearly done Hawn in, that trapper's roof was performing better than most modern residential construction does today. He didn't know that when he started pulling it apart. He was just looking for logs. The first thing that stopped him was the notching. Hawn's own cabin used a V-notch. Cut a rough groove in the top of each log, lay the next one across, let them sit. The V-notch was fast, simple, and had one critical weakness. As logs dried and shrank over months, the joint loosened. Gaps formed. Winter found those gaps. The old cabin used saddle notching. Each log had a deep, curved cut on its underside, a semicircular seat that dropped down over the log beneath it. The fit wasn't perfect. You could see daylight through the joint from the outside. But when Hawn started prying at the logs, he found something unexpected. The walls had gotten tighter over time, not looser. Every log sat on the one below it, under the full weight of every log above. The more logs stacked up, the harder the saddle joints pressed together. The dead weight of the roof, which was substantial, 3 or 4 times heavier than a shake roof, drove those joints closed. He spent a while with that, sat back on his heels and thought it through. His own joints had opened up because the wood dried and shrank away from the contact. These joints had closed up because gravity kept pressing them together. The design had used physics that he'd been accidentally fighting. The second was the chinking. What looked like a mess from 20 feet away was up close, a 3-layer system. Between the logs, Hawn found dried sphagnum moss packed tight, inches thick, backed by split wood chips that wedged into the widest gaps. Everything sealed on the outside with a thin layer of clay daubing. The daubing had cracked and weathered. It looked terrible. He'd assumed the whole thing was drafty because of how it looked. He was wrong. He peeled back a section of the clay and pressed his hand to the moss. In February, that moss was still springy, still held its shape. He pulled a chunk of it out and held it up this dense cellular material, each tiny plant chamber an individual pocket of trapped air. Biologists who study it today describe sphagnum cell structure as uniquely designed for water and air retention. What no mountain man in 1840 could have told you in those words, but what every one of them who used it could have told you in other words. It doesn't let cold through. Modern testing puts dried sphagnum moss at R2, 5 to R3, 5 per inch. For context, standard fiberglass bat insulation, the pink stuff, in every hardware store, runs R3, 1 to R4, 3 per inch. The mountain men were chinked with material that nearly matches it. Compared to Hawn's own cabin, where the gaps between logs were sealed with clay and rags, maybe R0, 5 per inch, maybe less, the difference was dramatic. He started to feel genuinely embarrassed about his own building. The floor stopped him for the longest time. Hawn had expected a dirt floor. Most trapper cabins had dirt floors, he knew that much. What he found instead was a puncheon floor. Logs split lengthwise with a froe and broad axe, the flat faces up, the round sides down, laid across 2 parallel stringers that raised the whole floor a few inches off the ground beneath. He pulled up one of the planks to look at what was underneath. There was a dead air space about 4 inches between the bottom of the puncheon floor and the packed earth below. In that space, in February, the air was cold but still, completely still. No draft, no circulation, just a sealed pocket of air sitting there between the floor and the ground. He got his face close to the gap and held his hand there for a long time. The ground itself, 6 inches below the bottom of the trapper's floor, registered a temperature somewhere around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm by any standard. But consider what Hawn's own floor was doing. Packed earth, direct contact, 0 air gap, conducting heat straight up and out of anyone who stood or sat on it through the simplest possible physical process. Heat moves from warm to cold through direct contact in damp earth. At 30 degrees Fahrenheit will pull warmth out of a person or an animal faster than almost any other material they're likely to touch. The puncheon floor broke that contact. The dead air gap between the plank floor and the earth beneath slowed that heat loss to a fraction. The split log surface itself dry wood, A poor thermal conductor added another layer of separation. Hawn had spent 14 months complaining that his feet were always cold. He was standing on frozen ground with nothing between him and it. Let's stop here, because there's a pattern forming that deserves attention before we get to the most important thing. Hawn found the thing that changed how he built everything afterward. The pattern is this. Every feature of the trapper's cabin that looked inferior, rough, or unfinished was actually performing a specific thermal function that the better version of that feature didn't perform. The sloppy-looking round logs with their gaps held tighter under load than hewn square logs with tight joints. The ugly dirt roof insulated 10 times better than a respectable shake roof. The moss filling the visible gaps was a more effective insulator than any material a frontier settler could purchase or manufacture. The crude split-log floor kept more heat in the building than a smooth earthen floor. The cabin was half buried in a hillside, which looked like poor planning, or a builder who didn't want to dig a proper foundation, but which cut the effective temperature difference between inside and outside by roughly half on the coldest nights. Every single one of these things Hawn had looked at and dismissed. Every single one. He'd walked past this cabin, glanced at it, and read it as evidence of incompetence. What it was, in fact, was evidence of roughly 30 years of trial and error conducted by men who understood, at a practical level, more about the physics of heat loss than any educated builder of the era could have told you from a book. The trapper who built this cabin Hawn never learned his name, likely first built something like what Hawn built. Maybe up on high ground, with a shake roof, well above the hillside for the view and the feeling of standing above the landscape. Then that cabin nearly killed him in the first serious cold snap. So the next one went into the hillside. The roof got covered with dirt. The walls got chinking that worked instead of chinking that looked good. The floor got raised. The joints got redesigned so they tightened instead of loosened. Each modification was a direct correction for a problem that had cost that man, specifically, in cold, in fuel, in comfort, or in survival. Hawn understood this. He sat in the doorway of the old cabin for a while, thinking about it. Then he walked back down to his own place. Here's what the buried in the hillside detail actually means, in numbers. In Montana's Gallatin Valley, average winter surface temperatures run from single digits to the low 20s Fahrenheit, but ground temperature follows a completely different curve. At 3 feet deep, year-round variation in that region shrinks to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. At 5 feet down, you're looking at temperatures that stay between 35 degrees Fahrenheit and 50 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of surface conditions. At 10 feet, the temperature barely moves from season to season. It sits at approximately the mean annual air temperature for the region, somewhere around 42 degrees Fahrenheit to 48 degrees Fahrenheit in that part of Montana. The trapper's cabin had 2 walls set directly against earthen banks. The soil in contact with those walls packed, settled, insulating, held at roughly 38 degrees Fahrenheit during the February cold snap that nearly finished Hawn. The temperature inside the cabin, which a small fire had kept at around 60 degrees Fahrenheit before it was abandoned, created a differential across those buried walls of about 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Hawn's exposed walls, at the same interior temperature, were facing outside air at negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit, a differential of 98 degrees Fahrenheit, 4.5 times higher. Heat loss through a wall is proportional to that differential. Everything else being equal, wall thickness, material, R-value. A wall facing 98 degrees Fahrenheit of differential loses 4.5 times as much heat as a wall facing 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The buried walls weren't as well insulated as exposed walls need to be. They didn't need to be. This is why the trapper could keep warm with a fire that would have been laughably inadequate in Hawn's cabin. It wasn't that he'd found better fuel. It wasn't that he'd found a more efficient fireplace design. He'd simply reduced the amount of work his heat source had to do by building a structure that kept the heat in. The comparison that makes this visceral. Imagine trying to heat a room with a window open versus a window closed. Both rooms have the same fire. One stays warm, one doesn't. The trapper had closed all the windows. Hawn had been trying to heat a room with several of them open, feeling puzzled by the results. It gets more specific than that, though. It gets down into the joints, into the moss, into choices so precise they tell you about the person who made them. Hawn found, when he got deeper into the demolition, that the moss wasn't just packed randomly into the gaps. It had been compressed, deliberately tamped in with a tool, pressed tight enough that air couldn't move through it. Sphagnum moss insulates because it traps still air in its cellular structure. If air can move through the moss, convection carries heat away and the insulation value collapses. The mountain man who packed that chinking understood this not in those words. But he knew that loose, fluffy chinking wasn't as warm as tight, compressed chinking. He'd found that out the hard way, probably, and packed it tight. Hawn also found that the clay daubing on the exterior wasn't a primary insulator at all. Clay insulates at roughly R0, 2 per inch, almost nothing. It was a weather barrier. It kept rain and wind from eroding the moss underneath. The clay could crack, could peel, could look terrible, and the actual insulation beneath it was still doing its job. The appearance was allowed to degrade because the appearance wasn't the thing that mattered. This is the part where Elias Hawn started to understand the problem with the way he'd been thinking about building. He'd been building for appearance, not deliberately, not consciously. But every choice he'd made that diverged from the trapper's choices had diverged in the direction of looking more like a proper house. The shake roof looked respectable. The hewn log walls looked finished. The tight, smooth, chinked surface looked solid. The raised floor with its visible joinery looked like craftsmanship. He'd built to the standards of what people in his home county in Ohio would have recognized as a good house, and none of those standards had been developed for a Montana winter at 5,000 feet. The trapper had built to the standards of survival. They are not the same standards. There's a broader history hiding behind the specific story of Elias Hawn's cabin, and it matters. The men who built these structures, Rocky Mountain trappers, mostly active between roughly 1,820 and 1,850, didn't arrive in Montana with this knowledge. They acquired it. And the primary channel through which they acquired it wasn't trial and error alone, though that was part of it. It was the people who were already there. The Nez Perce had been building semi-subterranean winter houses in the Columbia Plateau for at least 1,500 years before any Europeans set foot in the region. Their pit houses were dug 6 feet into the earth, framed with timber, covered with cedar bark, and packed grass and soil. The thermal logic was identical to the buried mountain cabin. Reduce the temperature differential at the wall. Let the Earth's stable temperature buffer against the surface extremes above. Some Nez Perce pit house structures were documented at over 100 feet in length, housing multiple families. The Mandan earth lodges of the Upper Missouri Permanent, massive structures up to 60 feet across, covered in thick sod, were so well insulated that George Catlin, who spent time among the Mandan in 1832, recorded that the interiors stayed warm through conditions that were lethal outside. These weren't primitive structures. They were sophisticated applications of materials science that Europeans had largely abandoned when they adopted stone and mortar construction in a different climate. Mountain men married into these communities. Jim Bridger married 3 native women over the course of his career: a Flathead woman, a Ute woman, and a Shoshone woman. Kit Carson's first wife was Arapaho. Joe Meek married 3 Nez Perce women. The knowledge transferred in domestic life, not in formal instruction. A Nez Perce woman knew how to read a hillside for where to site a winter shelter. She knew the difference between a cold air pool and a warm bench. She knew how to cut and pack sod. She knew which mosses worked and which ones didn't. Her husband was a man who needed to survive a Rocky Mountain winter, and that knowledge was directly relevant to his survival. This is why Warren Ferris, a Hudson's Bay Company trapper who wrote about his experiences in the 1830s, recorded something remarkable. He moved from a native lodge into a log cabin, and then moved back. He found the lodge more comfortable. This wasn't sentiment, it was physics. When Hawn rode back down from the old cabin that March, he sat with everything he'd found and tried to figure out what to do with it. He had a few options. He could continue with what he had, patch the worst of the draft problems, and manage with more wood. He could tear down and rebuild from scratch, using what he'd learned. Or he could modify, bank earth against the northern and western walls, re-shingle with sod, repack the chinking with proper material. He went with modification first, because he'd spent everything he had on the original construction and couldn't afford a full rebuild. He spent the spring of 1879 banking the north and west walls with earth, 2 feet deep at the base. He had a neighbor help him lay a sod roof over the cedar shakes, didn't remove the shakes, just laid sod on top of them, which added to the weight the structure had to carry, but didn't require tearing anything off. He pulled his chinking and replaced it with a combination of wood chips for backing and packed moss for insulation, covered with fresh clay. He also rebuilt his floor. Not immediately, that came in the fall, when he had time and material. He framed the floor up on stringers, left a 4-inch air gap below the planks, and laid a heavy canvas drop cloth over the earthen subfloor to block moisture. The first night after he finished the floor, he noticed his feet were warm for the first time since he'd arrived in the valley. The winter of 1879, 80 used less than half the wood of the previous winter. Hawn kept notes, not a formal journal, a set of penciled observations in the back of a seed catalog he'd brought from Ohio, which his grandson found decades later tucked inside a tobacco tin in what had been Hawn's second barn. The notes are fragmentary, but they're specific. One reads, "Old roof dirt 2-layer W. Poles underneath hold snow good never freezes through." Another, "Notch the curve way, not the point way tighter as it settles, never looser." A third, written in a different hand, possibly a neighbor's, added later, "Moss from the creek bend, works not the meadow flat Moss Creek bend, kind denser." This last detail matters more than it might seem. Sphagnum moss, the variety that grows in dense, waterlogged patches near streams, has a different cell structure than the drier bog moss that grows in flat meadow areas. Creek bend sphagnum compresses more densely, traps air more effectively, and has a higher R value. Someone had learned that specific distinction through experience, probably a cold winter following a summer where they'd used the wrong kind and passed it on. The people who built these cabins were not unsophisticated. They were sophisticated in exactly the ways their environment required, and unsophisticated in the ways their environment didn't punish. This is the moment in the story where most tellings would give you a clean ending. The settler learned the lesson, applied it, and lived warmly ever after. But what actually happened is more interesting and more instructive. Hawn didn't just apply the lesson to his own cabin. Over the following decade, he watched his neighbors, and he started noticing a pattern. The settlers who built on the valley floor following the logic that flat ground meant easy construction and proximity to water were the ones who consistently ran short of firewood. Their buildings sat in the cold air drainage. On clear, calm nights, cold air flowed down the surrounding hills and pooled in the low ground the way water does. The temperature in those spots ran 10 to 20 degrees colder than the benches above them, and on extreme nights, the difference could reach 30 degrees Fahrenheit or more. Hawn had read this in the landscape without understanding it until he'd pulled that old cabin apart and started thinking about where it was positioned. On a slight south-facing bench, clear of the valley floor, backed into the hillside above the cold air pool. The trapper had picked that site on purpose, not for the view, not for convenience, for warmth. Hawn started advising newer settlers about this when they came through asking about building sites. Most of them heard him out politely and built on the flat anyway, because the flat was easier and the bench seemed arbitrary. Then the first serious winter educated them in ways Hawn's advice couldn't. By 1885, he'd started pointing newcomers directly up to the old cabin's ruins, still standing, still half buried, the walls slowly weathering back into the hillside, and telling them to study it before they built anything. A few did. Here is the physics of cold air drainage, stated plainly, because it's one of those things where the science makes the history suddenly obvious. Cold air is denser than warm air. On clear, calm nights, exactly the nights that produce the most severe winter temperatures in Montana, surface air cools by radiating heat away to the sky. Warmer air above it is less dense and stays up. The cooled surface air gets heavier and flows downhill under gravity, the same way water does, but invisibly. It accumulates in basins, bowls, and valley floors. Meteorologists call this katabatic flow. Mountain men had no word for it, but they felt it every time they camped in a low spot and woke up far colder than they'd expected. Research from western Colorado mountain valleys shows these temperature inversions beginning 1 to 2 hours before sunset on clear nights, deepening rapidly, and producing temperature differences between valley floors and adjacent slopes of 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit by early morning. Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the kind of terrain the Gallatin Valley approximates, is one of the documented examples. Strong inversions regularly put upper slope temperatures, 30 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the valley floor at the coldest point of the night. What this meant for a settler in 1879, if you built on the floor of the Gallatin Valley and your neighbor built on the bench 150 feet above you, and the thermometer at your place read negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 a.m. In February, his thermometer might read negative 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Same night, same county. He's burning a third of your firewood to maintain the same temperature inside. His water bucket isn't frozen in the morning. His livestock are in better shape. He seems to be living in a slightly different climate. He is. He chose it. Or rather, the trapper who built the cabin he tore down chose it 50 years earlier, for the same reasons. Now, here's the thing about all of this that gets under the skin a little. None of it was secret. None of it was arcane or difficult to understand once someone showed you. Cold air falls downhill. You can observe that yourself in a single winter if you're paying attention. Thick earth holds heat better than thin boards. That's obvious once you've held your hand on both surfaces. Moss, packed tight in a gap, keeps out cold better than mud. You can test that in an afternoon. The knowledge was available. It was sitting in plain sight, in the form of every old trapper's cabin that settlers passed on their way to file their homestead claims. Dozens of those cabins dotted the Montana landscape by the time major settlement began in the 1870s. Fort Bridger, established by Jim Bridger in 1842, had been described by emigrants on the Oregon Trail as a set of miserable cabins with flat dirt roofs. The people writing those descriptions were cold and tired and needed horseshoe nails, and they were not paying attention to the engineering principles on display in front of them. Edwin Bryant passed Fort Bridger in 1846 and described the cabins as rudely constructed, bearing but a faint resemblance to habitable houses. The same flat dirt roofs, the same saddle-notched round logs, the same half-buried walls that Elias Hawn would find 30 years later to be performing thermal miracles. Bryant wasn't wrong that they didn't look like habitable houses. He just didn't understand what habitable actually required in that climate. The trapper's cabin communicated in a language that nobody who hadn't been nearly killed by a Rocky Mountain winter was equipped to read. Let's talk about why the puncheon floor is actually the most interesting thing in the whole story. Not because it's the most important thermal feature, the buried walls and the sod roof outperform it by a significant margin, but because of what it represents about how the trapper was thinking. A packed earth floor is the simplest possible floor. You tamp it down, you wet it and tamp it again, you let it harden. Done. No materials beyond what's already under you. No tools beyond a maul and your feet. A puncheon floor requires a froe to split the logs, a broad axe to dress the flat face, an adze to level the planks, and the time and skill to use them. It's significantly more work than dirt. In the calculus of a trapper building a winter cabin with one axe and a limited season, adding this labor made no sense unless he had a specific, felt reason for it. The reason was this: damp earth conducts heat out of a human body through direct contact faster than almost any other common surface. Cold, wet earth at 32 degrees Fahrenheit will draw heat from bare skin at a rate that produces frostbite. Cold, wet earth through a wool blanket is still dangerous. Cold, wet earth through a pair of moccasins in a cabin where you're trying to sleep for 8 hours will wake you up cold and tired every single time. The puncheon floor broke that conductive link. 4 inches of dead air below the planks, effectively invisible to anyone who didn't pull a plank up to look, delivered a thermal buffer that changed what happened inside the cabin overnight. The trapper had done the extra work because he'd slept on a dirt floor enough times to know exactly what it cost him. His floor remembered, in its construction, the cold nights that made it necessary. This is what distinguishes instinctual building from accidental building. The puncheon floor was a deliberate solution to a specifically understood problem. Someone had slept cold enough times on enough different surfaces to know which ones warmed you, which ones robbed you, and what you had to do about it. There's a thread running through all of this that deserves to be stated directly. The knowledge that produced the old trapper's cabin, the thermal mass of thick earthen roofs, the geothermal buffering of buried walls, the dead air insulation of compressed moss and raised floors, the cold air drainage avoidance of hillside siding. None of this was original to the trappers. The Nez Perce had been building semi-subterranean pit houses on the Columbia Plateau for somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 years. Those structures were dug 6 feet into the ground, covered in cedar bark, grass, and packed earth, and maintained interior temperatures comfortable enough for human habitation through winters that killed livestock in exposed corrals. Archaeological sites in the plateau region show continuous, consistent use of the semi-subterranean form across that entire span. This wasn't a technology they were still developing. It was finished. The Mandan earth lodges of the Upper Missouri, which George Catlin described from direct observation in 1832, were the largest and most thermally sophisticated of these structures, up to 60 feet in diameter, built over a shallow excavated pit, framed with heavy cottonwood posts, covered in willow branches, dried grass, packed earth, and sometimes a final layer of sod. Their east-facing entrances were positioned for morning solar gain. Their tunnel entryways, 6 to 15 feet long, acted as airlocks against wind, a principle modern passive house builders call a thermal vestibule. Catlin wrote that temperatures inside, during conditions he estimated well below zero outside, were comfortable. The trappers who lived among these peoples didn't sit in academic seminars learning thermal science. They married into communities where this knowledge was domestic knowledge, the kind of thing a wife knew because her mother knew, because her grandmother knew, going back to the beginning of memory. Warren Ferris moved back from a log cabin into a native lodge because the lodge was warmer. He didn't need to understand why. He was warm. The knowledge that Elias Hawn found in that old trapper's cabin was not 3 or 4 decades old. It was 3,000 or 4,000 years old. It had simply been translated imperfectly, partially, in a few critical details into the form of an anonymous log structure backed into a Montana hillside. There is one more thing that the seed catalog notes mention, and it's easy to overlook. One of Hawn's entries reads, "Low-end door, not high-end." He was describing door placement. The old cabin's door was on the downslope side of the structure, not at the top of the buried portion at the bottom. That seems counterintuitive if you think of the hillside as simply providing backing and insulation. But if you understand cold air drainage, it makes immediate sense. Cold air settled into the drainage below the cabin and stayed there. The door, placed at the low end, opened into slightly warmer air, the layer above the cold air pool. More practically, when you opened the door, cold air entered the cabin from below. Warm air exits structures through high openings. Cold air enters through low ones. The door placement controlled which air was doing which. It forced warm air to stay in the upper portion of the cabin interior and cold air to enter at the lowest possible level, where the fire could address it most directly. This is an aerodynamic principle that modern passive house designers call stack effect management. Nobody in 1845 called it that. But whoever built that cabin had observed enough times what happened when the door was in the wrong place. The blast of cold air that dropped interior temperatures instantly, the difficulty of rewarming after, and placed the door where the physics wanted it. Hawn rebuilt his own door on the downslope side of the house in the fall of 1879. Big difference, the notes say. No elaboration needed. The winter of 1880-81 became known across the northern Rockies and Great Plains as the Hard Winter. It was one of the most severe in recorded history for that region. Temperatures at Helena, Montana reached -52 degrees Fahrenheit at points during January 1881. Livestock losses were catastrophic across the territory. A number of settlers who had arrived in the preceding 5 years, built quickly, and gone into winter short on fuel didn't make it to spring. Hawn survived it in reasonable comfort. His modified cabin banked earthen walls, sod roof, repacked moss chinking, puncheon floor, downslope door, used approximately the same wood supply in 1880-81 as it had in the normal winter of 1879-380. Despite temperatures 30 to 40 degrees more severe, he had an extra 2 cords of wood left over in April. He'd also gotten 2 neighbors to follow his specifications in their own construction before that winter hit. One of them, a man named Jonas Frey, who'd arrived in the spring of 1880 and built from the beginning on a bench site with earthen backing, sod roof, and packed moss chinking, wrote in a letter to his family in Pennsylvania that he'd been comfortable in all but the coldest nights, which was more than the men on the flat ground could say. Frey's letter still exists, preserved in a private collection in Bozeman. He describes Hawn's advice in direct terms. He showed me an old cabin up the wash, been empty 10 or 15 years, and told me to notice how it was put together before I drove a single nail. I did, and I'm glad of it. That's the story. The old cabin up the wash. The man who went to pull it apart for lumber and ended up reading it instead. Here's what stays with you about this, if you think about it long enough. Elias Hawn wasn't an unusual man. He was a settler who built a cabin the same way every other settler built a cabin, suffered through 2 bad winters, went looking for free lumber, and by accident found himself holding a dismantled education in his hands. The education was available to every person who passed that cabin. The knowledge wasn't locked up. It wasn't written in a language you needed special training to read. It was written in curved log notches and packed moss and a floor raised 4 inches off the earth. Anyone could have walked up there, pulled it apart slowly, and asked the same question Hawn eventually asked. Why did they do it this way instead of the easier way? Most people didn't ask. They looked at what looked worse, the rough logs, the dirt roof, the low walls, and they moved on. They built what looked better, and they were cold. This is the pattern that appears over and over in the history of practical knowledge. The things that work often look worse than the things that don't. The primitive option, the old-fashioned method, the thing that's been sitting abandoned in a field for 15 years, these carry accumulated experience that is invisible until you pull them apart and look. Hawn looked. He tore down an old mountain cabin with an axe and a pry bar, and he found inside it the collected decisions of at least one man who'd been cold enough times that he'd stopped caring about what his building looked like and started caring deeply and specifically about what it did. That's not a small thing. Neither is the fact that behind that man's knowledge was the knowledge of people who'd been solving this exact problem in this exact landscape for 2,000 years, whose descendants were still living there, still building correctly, while settlers arrived and built badly and were cold and blamed the winters. The winters weren't the problem. They never were. When Hawn's grandson found the seed catalog notes in that tobacco tin, he was in the process of tearing down the old barn, which Hawn had also built in 1882, with earthen backing on the north wall and a heavy sod roof to put up a modern frame structure. The grandson was an educated man, a reader, and he recognized what he was holding. He kept the notes. He also kept the barn. He told a county historian who interviewed him in 1947 that his grandfather had said something about the cabin demolition that he'd remembered his whole life. The man who built that thing knew more about staying warm than anyone in this valley in 1879. Difference was, nobody had pulled it apart to find out yet. Nobody had pulled it apart to find out. Every piece of information was there, in the construction itself, the joints that tightened instead of loosening, the moss that trapped air in a million cellular pockets, the roof that held heat like a bank account, the walls that borrowed warmth from the earth and paid back a fraction of what the surface air demanded, the floor that broke the cold's most direct path into a sleeping man's body, the door that told the draft which way to go. It was all there. It just required someone willing to slow down in front of something that looked like failure and ask what it knew that he didn't.